And now we are going to hear from Alondra Nelson, who is the president of the Social Science Research Council and Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, the IAS. She joined the IAS faculty in 2019, following a decade at Columbia University, where she served as professor of sociology and the inaugural dean of social science. A sociologist of science, technology, and social inequality, Dr. Nelson is author, among other works, of the widely acclaimed book, The Social Life of DNA: Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. Dr. Nelson has also contributed to national policy discussions on inequality and the implications of new technology for society. She was elected to the American Philosophical Society just this year in 2020, and her talk today is on society after pandemic.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that nice introduction. Always a pleasure to be introduced by a fellow sociologist. And thank you to you and Professor Greenhouse for the invitation to share some ideas with the APS community today. So as Bob mentioned, one of the hats I wear and wear quite proudly is that of president of the Social Science Research Council, also known as the SSRC. And for us at the SSRC, the emergence of the novel coronavirus was rightly a call to arms. Actually, excuse me, I neglected to share my slides here. All right. So for us at the SSRC, the novel coronavirus was a kind of call to arms for us. And we, over the last 6 months, have devoted a considerable amount of effort to enabling scholars to consider how the tools of social science can help global society better understand the current and very dynamic present moment. These efforts, which have included the dissemination of research grants, essay fora, and pedagogical tools, have supported the practice of research in this critical moment and continued the mission of this organization, which is nearly 100 years old. Yet we also recognize that the practice of research, the very conditions of our work as researchers and as scholars, was being transformed and offered, on the one hand, some challenges, but on the other, an opportunity for some possible innovation and some reflection on the practice of research itself. The question of how to reopen our societies in the wake of the pandemic caused by the novel coronavirus, whenever that time comes, poses special questions for social researchers, beyond those of the immediate and difficult task at hand, which Dr. Fauci talked about at great length and with great eloquence earlier today. This reopening is also an opportunity to pose questions about the conditions of our work and of our lives. And as we ask what kind of society we might want after the pandemic wave crests, inherent in this question for scholars, I think, is the type of robust social research we will need to both understand and construct new social communities. These issues and concerns would be are central to what are now a collection of nearly 100 essays and reflections from leading social scientists on the intersection of the pandemic with a range of topics, including democracy and its discontents, the media and the so-called infodemic, COVID-19 in Africa and elsewhere beyond the United States, and the politics of modeling disease, among other themes. And I would point you to our website to learn more. So my remarks today draw from a collection of essays. I wrote an essay called Society After Pandemic in April of this year that launched our COVID-19 in the Social Sciences platform at the SSRC. And I'm now making that into a collection of essays and speaking to you today from some of my early meditations on the one hand, how human society is being transformed by the pandemic, a topic that has already been and will continue to be the focus of many books for many writers for many years to come. We are in the era of the pandemic book. But with these essays, Society After Pandemic, in addition to surveying social transformation, much of which is needed, I'm also interested in how the pandemic as a social shock and as a cultural force requires that may require that we revisit or perhaps even reimagine and remake some of the key assumptions of social thought. the concepts, the categories, the heuristics through which we understand the world. For example, COVID-19 has disrupted the practice of economics. The global economic crisis that immediately accompanied the pandemic was a downturn that lacked ready historical precedent, such that it could not be readily modeled using standard methods. In the United States, the pandemic response is realigning again the respective roles and responsibilities of state and federal governments against the backdrop of a reshuffled global political order, as scholars reckon with the decline of globalization and the persistence of asymmetrical national interdependence. Knowledge, the culmination of tested fact and hard evidence emerging out of research that was once relied upon as a ballast during times of social disorientation like this, is now subject to ideological litmus tests or ignored altogether, as Richard Overton showed quite beautifully in his presentation. In addition to introducing new dynamics, the pandemic has confirmed what scholars have long known about social inequality and the compounding and intersecting forces of race, class, and gender on disparate life chances. The disproportionate, life-threatening impact of the novel coronavirus on African-American communities across the United States, for example, is a symptom of the wider, deeper social pandemic of structural inequality. We have long known that socioeconomic opportunity, employment sector, incarceration and detention status, housing insecurity, and educational access have everything to do with health and well-being. In this context, what should be our prevailing theory of society after pandemic? After pandemic intervention breaks what we thought we knew about economy, about governance, about expertise, and confirms what we know but failed to address thus far fully about social inequality. I plan to take up these questions in my book in progress. And my time today, I want to address two smaller pieces of the answer to this larger question. COVID-19 has become a kind of social kaleidoscope, refracting phenomena, reassembling them in both new and familiar formations, with unfamiliar vividness. This unfamiliar vividness is apparent, I want to suggest, in the categories and concepts that have emerged or reemerged over the past 9 months. In particular, I want to reflect on the concept of expertise and the category of the essential worker. We have been lamenting the diminished status of expertise for decades, but rarely as often or with such high and dire stakes as in the last 9 months. My former teacher, Dorothy Nelson, in the Journal Social Studies of Science in 1975 wrote, quote, "Experts are resented and feared. While the reliance on experts is growing, we see a revival of Jacksonian hostility toward expertise and of the belief that common sense is an adequate substitute for technical knowledge," close quote. Here, of course, there are echoes of Hofstadter's anti-intellectualism in American life from about a decade prior. But for Nelson, this polarization of expertise emerged when scientific evidence and scientists were necessarily engaged in debates about controversial matters. And brought forward to today, obvious, vaccine hesitancy, disinformation more generally are certain controversies with which this is taking place. More recently, The Lancet declared that COVID-19 gives the lie to global health expertise, expressing exasperation at the failure of well-resourced societies like the US and the UK to address the pandemic. Pundit Tom Nichols declared the death of expertise, while sociologist of science Gil Ayal, my former Columbia colleague, finds that this crisis is in fact a crisis of state legitimacy. Indeed, he suggests that the rumors of the death of expertise have been somewhat exaggerated. I want to offer another angle on expertise that shows us that it is a valence of power and therefore also of inequality. I want to offer just a couple of brief examples from some fieldwork and research that I've been doing, but let me start with this one first. So you'll recall this is from October 15th of this year, a couple of weeks ago. The New York Times reporting on members of the Trump administration briefing effectively intellectual elites. These were the board of the Hoover Institution, and there were also some consultants there, hedge fund consultants in the room, about the stakes of the pandemic and about the seriousness of it. And I think what was important for me about this particular example was not just another example of, here we have the Trump administration again, sort of, lying or not telling the truth or not willing to accept the truth. I think all of that is certainly true. But this was an example in which we understood what the sort of denial of expertise, at least in the public, in the front stage, what it did in the world, right? So that the sort of denial of expertise, I want to say, has a kind of social function, and that social function is around galvanizing and aggregating power, and in this case, wealth as well. So this led to some selling off of wealth. Similarly, these are quotes that you will recommend from Bob Woodruff's interviews with President Trump. We have, going back as far as February, again, clear knowledge, right? It's not that that expertise is not known, and the knowledge or the sort of facts of what COVID-19 represented potentially for what COVID-19 meant for our societies, and it's the stakes of it and the deadliness of it was not known. It was that the sort of denial of expertise was kind of weaponized and mobilized to hold power in particular ways and to advance certain agendas. So I think it's really important to bring into the conversations about the lament of expertise or the possible death or crisis of expertise, what those claims about death or crisis do in the world, that they have a kind of social function that I think goes unarticulated, and that expertise is not in the abstract, some sort of pure form that's not deeply kind of implicated in these social, political, and economic processes. So that's the kind of high valence of inequality. That's sort of people get things in the world by sort of either hoarding or denying expertise and the facts from expertise. I'm going to show you how it operates on a different valence of society as well. In both my books, actually, both my monographs, The Social Life of DNA, which Bob kindly mentioned, and my first book, A Body and Soul, which was on African-American health activism in the 1960s and 70s, I use the concept of trusted experts and this sort of understanding that there are long-standing, well before we were declaring the crisis of expertise, even long before my late great teacher, Dorothy Nelson, was talking about a crisis of expertise in 1975, that there was an understanding in certain communities that all experts couldn't be trusted and that all experts didn't mean you well. And so in my work, I use the category of trusted experts, in this case, in The Social Life of DNA, to try to make sense of, briefly, why, despite sort of well-documented histories of medical experimentation and scientific research abuse, why African Americans would turn to genetics as a way to, as an opportunity to learn something about their identity. Sort of how does one sort of square that circle or sort of explain that paradox? And for me, the triangulation of trusted experts, people like an African-American geneticist I write about named Rick Kittles, who's able to articulate why they shouldn't, his customers shouldn't trust mainstream science, but why they should trust him is one way in which this happens. So I want to now talk to you about a fascinating group of activists in Queens, New York. Pictured in the gray sweatshirt, the hoodie in the foreground is a gentleman named K, the initial K Bain, who's the executive director of an organization called 696 Queensbridge, Build Queensbridge, which had really started out as a kind of anti-gun violence organization. But here, as early as March, this is from his social media account with his permission, as early as March 17, knew that even though President Trump was sort of saying in public that the epidemic was going away, people didn't need to wear masks, there was nothing to worry about, we had taken a turn, the language that we're familiar with, that they needed to have their own kind of expertise in their community. So he says, with the team today, still keeping the peace, doing what we can as community servants and public health workers. And few of them are actual public health workers here. They sort of understand themselves to have been taken a turn as public health workers, to educate the community on the need to social distance ourselves, wash our hands regularly, and avoid large crowds, et cetera. So I just wanted to offer that as a way in which certain communities understand that expertise can never be trusted purely, and that they have to sort of come up with their own resources of expertise and also resources of how to respond in conditions like the COVID-19 pandemic. Excuse me. This is also Kay Bain pictured again, standing in front of the 696 Build Queensbridge project. And he's saying here, dropping off some masks and gloves in the neighborhood today, emphasizing the need for physical distance, but social closeness at this critical time. Someone has to do it. So this is about, just a couple of weeks later. We need supplies desperately in our communities. Where is the support? Again, understanding the knowledge about the disease and the seriousness of the pandemic, lacking and having to sort of turn on oneself, as many as our communities did, to get the resources to move forward. So I want to move on, but I want to just say here that what I'm trying to suggest is that expertise is a valence of social stratification or of inequality that can be weaponized for some to seize and hold power and wealth, and that for other communities, expertise can be unreliable, hard to trust, and must be sort of generated amongst oneself with people who perhaps lack kind of the formal credentials that we would normally attribute to those we call experts. I now want to turn briefly to discuss race, class, and labor through the paradoxical new category of the essential worker. And in doing so, to suggest that the social categories on which we've come to rely may require some reconsideration. In 2016, when I published The Social Life of DNA, I published the Social Life of DNA, and this is a book based on a decade of ethnographic research following the emergence of a new startup industry, that is personal genomics, and a new technology, that is direct-to-consumer genetic testing. As I found, the receipt of genetic inferences about one's ancestral identity were the start of social and political journeys and practices rather than the final resolution to large, long-held questions or desires as they're represented on commercials for Ancestry.com and 23andMe and the like. So these practices included what I called reconciliation projects, by which I meant the use of genetics to attempt to answer or resolve issues about identity or about slavery or the history of racial slavery, political violence, and societies, and to trace and through this process that there was a tracing of new types of kinship. So not central to the book, but I think important for how forms of new social technology and new social practice create new social categories was the emergence in my research of new types of kinship, including phrases like quote unquote DNA cousin, quote unquote genetic relative, that suggested not only the ways through which these relationships were derived. I did genetic testing and now I have genetic cousins or genetic relatives. But I also want to suggest, and it was clear to me, that a new social formation was emerging such that to simply say cousin or relative without the qualifier DNA or genetic before it was understood, certainly by my informants, to be insufficient or imprecise. So this was a telling kind of qualifier. And I want to sort of think about this as an example of how new socialities often help us to think about how societies are emerging. And the new socialities emerging after pandemic, I think, offer us something to think, how to think about society after pandemic. Now, what of COVID-19 and social identity? We've seen the emergence of new social categories like social distancing, which is an older term from public health, giving new context and relevance. And we've also now been introduced to a category in a community, the COVID-19 long haulers, groups of individuals who have extensive experience and symptoms of COVID-19. We've also had these new kinds of sociality, pods for new social groupings. They could be for independent education efforts, college students living off campus in a sort of bubble is one of the ways we describe the new social groupings. They could be for networks of friends or relatives who agree to live by agreed upon rules to provide sociality and social support while sort of sheltering in place under the context of the pandemic. And of course, most famously, there's the NBA bubble, which seemed to work quite fine, and the NFL bubble that didn't work as well. So I wanted to bring one category to our attention today, and that's of the essential worker. I think attention to new categories after pandemic and that sort of shift after pandemic allow us to see new forms of inequality and vectors of inequality, as well as possibilities for new community formation that might continue well after the pandemic. So typically, these are essential workers. At the top this is from an article in Brookings, a woman store clerk checking someone out at a counter. This at the bottom is a fairly well-traveled Reuters photograph of some Trump supporters who, resistant to wearing masks, being confronted by other essential workers. These are healthcare professionals. This photograph was taken by Jelani Cobb, the historian. He did one of our COVID-19 components of our COVID-19 platform at the SSRC, are short interviews in which we ask individuals to sort of pick an artifact, a data set, a graph, a photograph that they think really encapsulates this moment. This photograph from Jelani is of another essential worker, a food delivery driver in front of a Louis Vuitton store that's been boarded up in New York City. So the way that we've talked about the essential worker has really been about this kind of inequality, but it's actually a far more complicated category than this. It's a category mandated by law. As sociologist Andrew Lakoff notes in a recent essay on the Social Science Research Council website, quote, "The category of essential worker arose from a broader security framework dating from early Cold War for governing collective life in a future emergency. Specifically, it comes from the practice of defining certain industrial and service sectors as elements of quote unquote critical infrastructure." Lakoff continues, quote, "A mechanism was put in place to reduce vulnerability at the level of the system, generated another form of risk at the level of individuals and communities who are classified as essential," close quote. So, the sort of the legal process by which we get essential workers after pandemic, after COVID-19 arrives in the United States, emerged from a kind of brief invocation of the need of workers to go to work who work in quote unquote the space of critical infrastructure. So there's a very short paragraph from President Trump in the context of some other guidance about COVID-19, followed by a memo from DHS in 2019. This is a second memo. The initial one was in March of 2019. Which was a memorandum on identification of critical infrastructure workers during COVID-19 response that followed President Trump's sort of invocation of the critical infrastructure mandate. So it's left up to the states to interpret how they want to designate essential workers. So this is an example from Illinois. So this is how it was interpreted by Governor Pritzker there, and Executive Order number 8. And it really, as you can see, cuts across a wide swath of people that really cut across how we've been representing essential workers, and also across traditional kind of ideas of race and class inequality. So I allow you to read this. They're different from state to state. Fascinating in some ways about Illinois is that it included cannabis agriculture, as well as cannabis dispensaries and cannabis cultivation centers. Less surprising, essential workers included reproductive health providers, various manufacturers, logistics and warehouse operators. Maybe surprising, veterinary care and all kind of veterinary healthcare services. Surprising to some, perhaps, firearm and ammunition suppliers and retailers for the purposes of safety and security. As well as a range of state-operated institutional and community-based settings for providing various services to the public. So there were people who, there were services from certain people, and those people were deemed essential workers, but essential workers were also those who provided services to certain groups: rehabilitation services, developmental centers, adoption agencies, et cetera. So our default has been to think of essential workers as, mostly healthcare workers, service workers, delivery workers, retail sales for food and the like. a kind of category that might also be able to be collapsed into the traditional category, at least in the social sciences, of the working class. But this category really fails to help us understand who is deemed essential in this more cross-cutting way. Yes, essential workers are disproportionately black and brown people in the United States, also key workers as they're called in the UK. But more complicated in this, the essential worker reveals both who is valued and who is devalued, who is protected and essential, who is essential but at risk. The inequality and risk that is produced at the conjunction of inequality is produced at the conjunction of protection from risk and exposure to it, even within the class of essential workers, who I want to point out include professional services, financial institutions, and the like. So the inequality here is a double move, not just damage to some, those who are at risk, who we typically think about as essential workers, but a pronounced benefit to others that create a kind of gulf in inequality. So I want to offer the essential worker as a kind of thought experiment around social categories and social stratification after pandemic that might provide some explanation of the society that we might be heading, that we live in and might be heading toward. A confrontation with structural racism and discrimination requires a confrontation with the fact that race may not be the most salient or only demographic category for our work as scholars, researchers, analysts, as we try to make sense of this moment. Society always, and certainly after a pandemic, is dynamic, including the concepts and categories we come to use, among them expertise and essential workers. The question we face is not only what is society to become after the COVID-19 pandemic, but how do the social conditions exposed, exacerbated, and created by the novel coronavirus demand that we substantively rethink our ideas of society, and therefore some of the prevailing theories of the human sciences and of social life. This is an opportunity to pose questions about the conditions of our work as scholars and as citizens, to ask what kind of society we want after the pandemic wave crests, and to understand that inherent in this question is also the type of robust social research we will need to both appreciate and construct society anew. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. Again, we're running a bit late, so I'm just going to ask one question, and it's something that I've been thinking about, and that is, what do you make of the use of virtual communication in the context of both of what's happening now and what may happen after the pandemic? On the one hand, I suspect that we're all getting tired of it, but I think it has, in some ways, really kind of broadens people's reach, their ability to interact after almost personally over very long distances without getting on airplanes. But it is an unequal technology, and it strikes me that may have some really serious implications for future inequality as well as present inequality.
No, I think that, of course, is exactly right. One of the projects that we have at the Social Science Research Council is called the Public Health Surveillance and Human Rights Network, and it's legal scholars, social scientists, and technology and surveillance advocates asking precisely this question. And for me, the work has really been guided by this wonderful quote from the political science Adam Porsky, who basically says, once we learn, governments learn how to do these things, around technology, and they don't forget. So they may not use them after the state of emergency abates, but they don't forget. So something to remember is that there's always, we've invoked already twice 1984, there's always that kind of looming, I think, concern. And I think it's a legitimate concern. But I think it has been really transformative. And I think that the sort of turn to virtuality in many ways is quite permanent. And I think it's again, as I was trying to suggest with the essential worker, probably more complicated than I think that we're talking about it thus far. There's a short essay that I read that was in Public Affairs, Foreign Affairs, that the sociologist Richard Sennett wrote, which was talking about basically slums in India and the sort of repurposing of effectively dating apps for people who were under-resourced, right? So we're often thinking about the sort of Apple Google kind of API, sort of contact tracing apps. But this is a different kind of technology, and Sennett's really wonderful reading of it. It is allowing people to grieve together, to sort of be in communication in ways they might not be able to be otherwise. So I think, like technology, often, in this case, not new technology, but a kind of new social shock that's cultivating kind of new context for the use of technology, that there are some kind of possibilities for new, I think, liberatory and communitarian potential. But this goes to Richard's talk previously, the sort of bigger kind of looming danger of kind of data capture, I think, remains. But I think it's good that we've learned that one can celebrate and mourn and be together in other modalities besides sort of being in physical space, although that might be ideal for all of these things. But and certainly as a sociologist of technology in part, I think this is one of the central kind of questions that we'll continue to face about this moment.
Thank you very, very much.